All right, let's dive into this. You brought this really fascinating collection of excerpts from art therapy with young survivors of sexual abuse lost for words. And it's not just theory, right? It's like
Yeah.
really getting into the nitty-gritty of how art can be this powerful tool for healing and helping these kids, these children and adolescents who have experienced, just profound trauma to communicate.
Yeah, and it's not just one perspective either. I mean, we're hearing from a whole bunch of really experienced art therapists, people like Jenny Murphy, Felicity Aldridge, Maggie Ambridge, Karen Lee Drucker, and Ann Gillespie.
Oh, and Mark Wheeler too.
Oh, of course, Mark Wheeler, yes. Each one bringing their own unique, kind of clinical wisdom to the table. And then we have these like really powerful case studies and discussions about how this plays out in group therapy settings.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, we're really trying to get at the heart of like, how does art therapy actually work in these situations?
Mhm.
What makes it so effective? What are some of the challenges that come up? And, the unique possibilities that it offers. And what the things that the book really emphasizes is, how art can get around those limitations of just talking about things, right?
Right.
Especially for kids who have gone through such intense experiences. It can tap into these sensory memories that might be buried really deep.
Yeah, it's so crucial because often, especially after trauma, words just aren't there, especially
Yeah.
for kids.
Right, and it helps navigate that like really complex emotional world that these young people have been through.
It highlights the importance of nonverbal expression when language just fails us.
So here's where it gets really interesting. We're
Hmm.
going to look at some concrete examples of how art therapy can like actually bring that hidden trauma to the surface and allow those really overwhelming emotions to come out
Right, like anxiety, rage, shame, the terror, all those really, really difficult emotions.
and help rebuild a sense of safety and trust, through the therapeutic
Mhm.
relationship.
Yeah.
So one of the big things the book talks about is the power of nonverbal communication, right?
Mm.
It points out that these kids who have been abused often don't have the words, the vocabulary to even describe what happened to them,
Yeah.
especially if the abuse happened, when they were really young,
Right, when those language centers aren't even fully formed yet.
right? And the book even says that trauma can like be held in the body itself.
It's true. It's like those memories are encoded in our very cells.
So why do you think art becomes such a crucial tool in these cases?
Well, if those language pathways, if those language centers haven't developed yet, or if the trauma has sort of disrupted those pathways, or even if those memories are primarily sensory and emotional, art gives them a completely different way to express themselves.
It's like a back door in a way
Mm.
to their experience.
Exactly. It allows them to bypass having to put those feelings and experiences directly into words.
Yeah.
And this idea of a transitional space, it really resonates here. It's like this psychological area that feels safer, less intense than, having to directly recall what happened verbally.
Right, it takes the pressure off.
Yeah, and even transference, which is when feelings towards people from the past, important figures, get unconsciously shifted onto the therapist.
Right.
That can actually happen through the art materials themselves.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So it's almost like they're taking these things that are trapped inside and like putting them out into the world, making them real.
Exactly, making the internal
Yeah,
external.
externalizing them. And the book mentions how art materials and images can actually help these kids express, contain, and then acknowledge those traumatic feelings,
Yeah.
which is kind of like the first step, right?
The first step in separating from the trauma and starting to heal.
Yeah, starting to heal. And it also mentions how the creative process itself, like just the act of making art, can help rebuild a child's self-esteem, strengthen their ego.
Exactly, that core sense of I am, which can be so damaged by abuse.
Yeah,
Being able to create something, to master a material, to make something where there was nothing before,
right.
that can be so empowering for a child.
It gives them a sense of agency, a sense of control.
Exactly.
I remember there were a couple of really powerful examples in the book. One was Joanne, who painted this picture of herself drowning in the ocean during a storm.
Oh, yes,
And there
Joanne.
was this speech bubble coming from her that said, "Mom, you weren't there."
Yeah, heartbreaking.
So powerful.
Yeah.
What do you think that image tells us about what was going on inside her?
Well, if we look at it through the lens of attachment theory, which is all about those early bonds we form with our caregivers and how they shape our sense of safety and security,
Right.
her artwork is really like this incredibly poignant illustration of a rupture in that attachment.
A broken bond.
Yeah, broken bond.
Yeah.
The stormy ocean, that represents this overwhelming distress, feeling completely overwhelmed.
Right.
And the absence of her mother in that scene, in that imagined scene, it speaks volumes about feeling abandoned, not having that secure base, that feeling of not being protected when she needed it most.
Yeah. Completely alone in this terrifying experience.
Exactly.
And then there was Simon, who made this clay figure that he called a dung boy, and it kept falling apart.
Oh, Simon. Yes, I remember that.
It's almost like this physical manifestation of his own, like, inner turmoil and fragility.
Yes, and that eventually led to him disclosing the abuse by his brother, right?
Yes. How do you think the art might have helped him to finally speak about what happened?
Well, I think the nonverbal act of creating the molding of the clay and then seeing this figure constantly break down,
Hmm.
it might have given him a way to communicate what was happening inside before he had the words.
To show it instead of say it.
Exactly. The dung boy, constantly falling apart, it could have symbolized his own feelings of being broken, damaged, yeah, worthless, unclean. And by making it tangible, by putting it outside of himself, it maybe became less threatening to actually talk about the experience that mirrored that feeling of internal collapse.
You give him a way in.
Yeah.
The book also talks about the role of sensory experience in art therapy, and it focuses specifically on materials like sand and water.
Ah, yes, the sand tray.
And it suggests that these materials can actually reawaken those sensory memories, the ones that might have been, like, shut down or buried through dissociation.
Right, that psychological distancing from overwhelming experiences.
Yeah. So why do you think these materials, in particular, sand and water, are so effective in this work?
Well, think about it. Trauma, it can be encoded in our bodies as these sensory memories, even
Mhm.
before we have the ability to understand them cognitively. And materials like sand and water, they have this really primal, tactile quality that can
Yeah.
tap into those early pre-verbal experiences.
It's like they speak a language that the body understands.
Exactly. And Anne Gillespie's work, she really highlights this, how the actual feeling of these materials, the feeling of sand between your fingers, the coolness of the water,
Right.
it can connect with these memories that are held in the body, even if you can't access them through, conscious thought or language.
So it's like a direct line to those buried experiences.
Hmm.
And another thing the book talks about is how the messiness of sand and water play can actually be really beneficial,
Oh, absolutely.
especially for kids who might be afraid of failing or who need to have a lot of control.
Yeah, it's that lack of expectation. The book calls it a non-product, non-achieving activity
Right.
because there's no right or wrong way to play with sand and water.
Right.
It's just exploration, it's freedom.
And no pressure to perform.
Exactly. And for kids who may feel this immense pressure to be good or who have experienced this profound loss of control through abuse, that can be incredibly liberating.
It's like permission to just be.
Yeah. It's an antidote to that hypervigilance and self-criticism that often comes with trauma.
And the book also highlights how malleable sand is, right? How it allows kids to, like, play with ideas and forms without a lot of limitations. It could become anything. Landscapes,
Mm.
bodies, these symbolic representations. It's like its own language.
Yes, and what's so fascinating about sand is that it can be both firm and fluid at the same time. It can
Okay.
be structured and unstructured.
It's adaptable.
Exactly, and that really mirrors the often chaotic and shifting nature of traumatic memories and emotions.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Kids can create and destroy with ease, experiment with different narratives, play with different feelings in a way that feels safe and contained.
It's all contained within that sand tray.
Yes.
And then there's water. Water can bring up such strong emotions and associations, things like flooding, drowning, feeling out of control.
Mm.
But the sand tray itself, it acts as a container for all of that, doesn't it?
Exactly. The physical boundaries of the sand tray, they provide a sense of safety, of containment.
It's like a safe space to explore those feelings.
Yeah, it's like the tray can hold the intensity of those emotions.
So they don't feel like they're going to be completely overwhelmed.
Exactly.
There was that example in the book about Nadia, who started playing with muddy water in the sand tray, and then moved on to cleaning these precious marbles.
Oh, yes, Nadia. Her process was so symbolic.
It seemed like this journey from feeling dirty or contaminated
Mm.
to, like, reclaiming something valuable within herself.
Yeah, if you think about it symbolically, the muddy water could represent those feelings of contamination, the emotional turmoil that comes with the abuse.
Right.
And then cleaning those marbles, that suggests a movement towards purification, recovery, reclaiming that inherent worth and innocence.
It's like a nonverbal story of healing.
Yes, exactly.
Trust is obviously a huge issue when working with these kids, considering what they've been through.
It's foundational, really.
Their trust has been so deeply betrayed. So let's talk about the therapeutic relationship, because that seems so crucial in this work. What are some of the key things that therapists need to keep in mind?
Well, building trust is absolutely essential, and therapists need to be prepared for a whole range of really intense emotional
Because
reactions.
it's not going to be a smooth, easy process, right?
Right, it's going to be messy. These kids might direct anger at the therapist, they might attack the art materials, they might withdraw.
They might shut down completely.
Exactly, and these are all ways of protecting themselves.
Right.
So the therapist's consistent presence, their empathy, their clear boundaries, that's what creates a sense of safety.
Yeah, it's like creating this safe container for them to finally let go. It
Exactly.
must be so hard to navigate all of those different reactions, though.
It is. It's definitely challenging.
The book also brings up the complexities of male therapist countertransference.
Yes, that's important to address.
And Mark Wheeler and Becky Smith talk about feelings like guilt, fear for their disclosures, and even revulsion that can come up for male therapists.
Yes.
Why is it so important for male therapists to be aware of these feelings?
Because it's about self-awareness, Unacknowledged countertransference, those are the therapist's own unconscious emotional responses to the client.
Right.
And if those aren't recognized, they can really impact the therapy in unintended
They
ways.
can get in the way.
Yeah. So for a male therapist working with a child who has experienced sexual abuse, those feelings of guilt, fear, they need to be acknowledged and processed so they don't lead to, avoidance or overprotection or other unhelpful responses.
Right. It's about understanding how their own baggage might affect the therapy.
Exactly. And a non-abusing male therapist can actually offer a very powerful corrective relational experience.
Right.
But that self-awareness is absolutely key.
So it's not about excluding male therapists, but it's about them doing their own work.
Yes.
Maggie Ambridge also talks about how important it is to work with the mothers of these kids, many of whom are survivors themselves.
Yes, that's a really important point.
So how does a mother's own history of abuse affect the child's therapy?
Well, if we think about intergenerational trauma, we see how that unresolved trauma in the mother can create these dynamics that actually get in the way of the child's healing.
It ripples down through the generations.
It does. And that emotional landscape within the mother-child relationship, it can reflect and even perpetuate those hidden experiences.
Yeah, it's like they're both trapped in this cycle.
So working with the mothers in parallel with the child's therapy can help them process their own trauma,
Right.
which then allows them to create a more supportive and attuned environment for their child to heal.
So it's like healing on multiple levels.
Exactly.
Going back to Joanie, you know, her interactions with her therapist really show how complicated transference can be, especially around idealization and testing boundaries.
Mm.
She seemed to really crave that connection with her therapist, but would also push the limits of that professional relationship, especially around intimacy and the therapist's personal life.
Yeah, she was really testing those boundaries.
What are some of the key things that therapists need to be mindful of in those situations?
Well, it's a delicate balance, right?
Right.
Because you have to maintain those professional boundaries while still offering warmth and empathy.
So it's not about being cold and distant.
No, not at all. But idealization, that can be a way for a child to try and get the nurturing that they've been missing.
Right.
And the therapist has to be very careful to guide that relationship back to a therapeutic focus.
So gently redirecting them.
Exactly. And the therapist also has to be aware of their own vulnerabilities, not oversharing personal information, not blurring the lines of the professional relationship.
So being really mindful of those boundaries.
And the fact that the therapist mentioned being concerned about potential false accusations,
Yeah.
that really highlights this really, really delicate balance between trust and professional responsibility in this work.
It's a lot to juggle.
It is.
Now, the book also explores group therapy, which seems like a really valuable way for these kids to connect with other survivors.
Oh, absolutely.
What are some of the unique benefits of that approach?
Well, I think the most powerful thing about group therapy is that it allows them to share their experiences with others who understand what they've been through.
So they don't feel so alone.
Exactly. It breaks down that sense of isolation and shame. Just knowing that others have gone through similar trauma can be incredibly validating,
Yeah.
and it can foster the sense of community and mutual support.
A sense of belonging.
Exactly. And having co-therapists, a male and a female therapist leading the group together,
Mm-hmm.
that can also provide a more well-rounded model for exploring things like parental and sibling dynamics.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there's a whole section on sibling group therapy, which Felicity Aldridge and Simon Haslow describe as like really intense, but also potentially incredibly healing.
Yes, sibling groups can be very powerful.
They talk about these recurring themes that come up like safety, secrecy, rivalry, fear of abandonment. Why do you think it's so important to address those themes specifically within a sibling group?
Well, because abuse can really shatter those family bonds,
Right.
and it can create these really complex dynamics between siblings.
Right, like guilt, resentment, the burden of keeping secrets.
Exactly. So the sibling group, it gives them a unique space to work through those things directly.
Mm.
It allows them to explore their shared trauma together,
Yeah.
to reestablish trust and communication,
Right.
and to challenge those unhealthy patterns that may have developed because of the abuse.
It's like they're relearning how to be a family.
In a way, yes.
But the book also mentions how the children's behavior in these sibling groups can be really complex.
It can be.
Sometimes it reflects things that are happening outside of the group, like the stress of being in foster care or the possibility of being adopted.
Yeah, there are so many layers to consider.
Even things like fighting can have different meanings.
Right. It might be a way to express anger, but it also might be a way of seeking physical contact, trying to connect with their siblings in a distorted way.
So how do therapists make sense of all of those behaviors in the group setting?
It's about understanding the communication that's happening beneath the behavior. Therapists have to look beyond the surface and ask themselves, what is this child trying to express? Is this about unresolved trauma? Is it anxiety about their living situation? Are they testing boundaries?
Right, there's so many possibilities.
Exactly. And being attuned to those different possibilities is crucial.
And even seemingly simple things, like playing hide and seek in therapy, can have these deep connections to attachment and feelings of loss.
Yeah, those games are never just games. They're always revealing something about the child's inner world.
Right. And the book points out that art in sibling therapy often becomes this starting point for interaction and play, like a shared language.
Absolutely. It gives them a way to connect without having to immediately talk about the trauma directly.
It takes the pressure off.
Exactly. And creating art together, it can be this bridge for communication and emotional expression, especially when words feel too risky.
Yeah.
It gives them something to focus on together, shared activity that allows them to interact without feeling so exposed.
So it's like a stepping stone to deeper communication.
Yeah.
The book also emphasizes the importance of having parallel groups for parents or carers to support the work that's happening with the kids and to help the adults be more involved in their child's recovery.
Yeah, because the child's healing doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It's
Right.
all about the environment around them. So involving the caregivers, giving them their own space to process and heal, it creates this much more stable and nurturing environment that can really reinforce the progress the child is making in therapy.
It's like a team effort.
Exactly.
Honey M. Brown and Marianne Latimer talk about their work with adolescent girls, and they point out how quickly group dynamics can emerge.
Oh, yeah. Adolescent groups are very interesting.
But sometimes the girls start off resistant to using the art materials because they're afraid of what might come out.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you navigate that resistance?
Well, you have to remember that adolescents, they're at a stage where they're very self-conscious.
Right, they're figuring out who they are.
Exactly. So being in a group can feel really vulnerable.
It's like they're putting themselves out there,
Yeah. So the first priority is building trust and safety within the group.
creating that sense of safety again.
Exactly. And as the girls start to feel more comfortable, you can encourage that sense of shared experience, help them support each other.
And that helps overcome the initial reluctance to participate.
It does. And as that resistance fades, the real therapeutic power of the group can start to emerge.
And they can start to heal together.
Yes.
The book also mentions that sometimes that tension between victim and perpetrator can actually play out in the group.
Right.
sometimes through self-harm or through kids being abusive towards each other.
Yeah, it's like they're reenacting those dynamics.
So how does the group help them to work through those really complicated feelings?
Well, the group becomes this microcosm for exploring those internal conflicts.
Hmm.
Group members might unconsciously start to play out the roles from their trauma,
Right.
and the therapist's job is to help them understand those patterns, to help them process the underlying feelings of anger and helplessness.
So they can start to break free from those roles,
Exactly, and to start to shift the responsibility for the abuse away from themselves.
which is huge.
It is.
Another important point that the book makes is that you can't approach therapy with every child in the same way. You have to consider their developmental stage.
Absolutely. Development is key.
Joe Bissonnet even refers to Erickson's stages of psychosocial development. So why is it so important to have that developmental lens when you're working with these kids?
Because a child's experience and expression of trauma, their ability to understand and process what happened, it's all going to be shaped by where they are developmentally.
So a 5-year-old is going to process things differently than a 15-year-old.
Exactly. A preschooler is going to understand and express trauma in a completely different way than a teenager will.
Right.
And Erickson's model, it gives us this really helpful framework for understanding the key psychosocial tasks that kids are working on at different ages.
Right.
And that can really inform the therapist's approach.
I remember that example of Hannah, the 7-year-old girl who used art and play to explore these unspoken questions about her mother's own history of angos.
Oh, Hannah.
Questions that she probably couldn't have even put into words at that age.
Yeah.
So how did the art help her do that?
Well, for younger children, symbolic play and art are incredibly powerful tools. So for Hannah, her creations, they gave her this safe and indirect way to explore those really complex family dynamics and anxieties that she was probably sensing but couldn't fully understand.
So it was a way for her to process things on her own terms.
Exactly. And through metaphor and symbolic representation in her art, she could grapple with these really heavy, unspoken realities in a way that felt manageable for her developmental level.
It gave her a way to make sense of things.
Mm-hmm.
And the book points out that as kids move into adolescence, they start to grapple with more specific issues around identity and sexuality.
Yes, that's a really critical period.
So how can art therapy groups help them navigate those often confusing feelings, especially in the context of their trauma?
Well, it's important to remember that trauma can really intersect with the already complicated process of adolescent development.
Right, it's like adding another layer of complexity.
Exactly. And issues like identity formation, body image, sexuality, those can be particularly challenging for young people who have experienced abuse. So art therapy groups, they can provide this really non-judgmental space for them to explore those confusions and anxieties
Right.
and to start to integrate those experiences into their developing sense of self.
So it's about helping them understand who they are in light of what they've been through.
Exactly.
Even the way Hannah used clay and salt sculpture at the end of her sessions seemed really significant.
Oh, yes, the salt sculptures.
It was like this deeper level of processing, and she had this tangible thing that she could take with her, like a reminder of her healing.
Exactly. It's a way for the child to create this physical representation of their internal world
Right.
and to have something concrete that symbolizes their journey and their progress.
The book describes it as like these different colored layers of feelings in the salt sculpture,
Yeah.
which is such a powerful image of integration.
It is. It's about making the internal external and giving the child a sense of closure and continued growth even after the therapy session ends.
So it's like they're taking their healing with them. The book also really emphasizes that it's not just about what happens in the therapy room. It's about the bigger picture.
Right. The context is everything.
It's about collaboration with other professionals, with the child support system.
Absolutely. A child's healing is so deeply influenced by the environment around them.
Right.
So having those supportive structures in their life, in their home, in their school, that's essential for therapy to be truly effective.
So it's about working together, therapists, foster parents, social workers, teachers.
Exactly. And that means communicating clearly, sharing information, coordinating care.
But that can be challenging, right? Because everyone might have different perspectives, different anxieties.
It can be. There might be different priorities, different approaches,
Yeah.
but a well-coordinated and informed network of support, that creates a much stronger foundation for the child's recovery.
It's like they're all holding the child together.
Yes.
And that second case study with Hannah, the one where there wasn't enough legal evidence to prove the abuse, despite the therapist's concerns, that really shows how complicated things can get.
Yeah, that's a tough situation.
So, what do we learn from those kinds of cases?
Well, I think it highlights the really difficult ethical decisions that therapists sometimes have to face
Right.
because their clinical judgment, based on what they're seeing in the child, it might not align with the legal requirements for intervention.
Yeah, that's a tough spot to be in.
It is, but it underscores the importance of advocating for the child's well-being within the system, even when it's complicated.
So, speaking up for the child, even when it's hard.
Exactly, and making sure that the child's voice and their experience are at the center of the process.
So, taking all of this in, what does it mean for our listeners? This deep dive into art therapy with young survivors has really shown us how powerful creative expression can be.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It can help these kids access and process trauma in ways that talking sometimes just can't. And we've seen how art therapists, they have to navigate these really complex emotional landscapes, build trust, create safety, and often they're doing all of this while working with caregivers and a whole network of other professionals.
It's very delicate work.
It is.
But when you step back and look at it, art therapy provides this incredibly valuable window into the inner world of children who have endured unimaginable things.
Right.
And it offers them a pathway towards healing that honors their nonverbal experiences and their incredible resilience.
Absolutely. And here's where it gets really interesting. Think about all of those powerful images and metaphors that we've discussed, like the black hole or the secret bag with a baby inside. How do those artistic expressions communicate such profound experiences of trauma and fear, things that might be impossible to put into words?
It's like they're speaking a different language, a language of the soul.
Yeah. And what about that simple act of burying and then unearthing objects in the sand tray? What does that tell us about the dynamics of secrecy and then finally revealing the truth?
Well, I think it shows us that art has this innate ability to bypass our conscious defenses and to communicate these really deep, often painful experiences through symbols.
Yeah.
Those images, they offer us this incredible insight into the child's inner world.
Right.
And they often reveal layers of meaning that words just can't capture.
So it's like a whole other way of understanding.
Exactly.
This exploration is a really powerful reminder that healing from trauma, it's not a linear process. It's multifaceted, it takes time, and art therapy offers a unique and incredibly valuable path. It highlights the importance of patience, of understanding the nuances of countertransference, and of always considering the child's developmental stage.
Absolutely. And for me, what really stood out is the emphasis on the therapist's own self-awareness. Recognizing that the therapeutic relationship is this really dynamic interplay of emotions and experiences. It requires constant reflection, constant ethical consideration.
It's a big responsibility.
It is.
So, here's a final thought for our listeners to consider. Given how powerful art therapy is and how it can get around those conscious defenses, what can it teach us about understanding and addressing other kinds of deep emotional experiences, even ones that aren't necessarily related to trauma?
That's a great question.
Could engaging with creative expression, in all its forms, be a key to unlocking deeper truths in other areas of our lives?
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What if we all tapped into that creative potential within ourselves? What might we discover?
What might we heal?